Lecture sponsored by the University of Minnesota's China Center. My name is Meredith McQuaid. I'm the Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs at the University of Minnesota. I'm really delighted that you are here and am certain that we are all in for a terrific Chinese New Year celebration today, which will begin very shortly with the lecture by Dr. Weiping Wu. As most of you are already aware, the university's China Center is an important link to our collective work with and about China. For more than 30 years, the China Center has inspired and supported collaborations, partnerships, research, and exchange with many, many institutions across China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. We are proud of the many accomplishments of the China Center and of the strong ties it has established for this university and the state of Minnesota through its work. The China Center is one unit within the recently renamed Global Programs and Strategy Alliance, or GPS Alliance, which serves as the driving force for globalizing teaching, learning, research, and engagement at the University of Minnesota. This year, the GPS Alliance is shining one of our two global spotlights on the impact of urbanization in the world. And we are absolutely thrilled that we have found a talented, thoughtful speaker who will today weave together our long-standing connections to China with our topical focus on urbanization. It is my great pleasure to first introduce the interim director of the China Center to you, and she will then tell you more about the Bob and Kim Griffin lecture. As many of you know, our good friend and colleague, Dr. Zhang Yongwei, departed the China Center in December, having served as director there for just over 3 years. And while we were sad to see Dr. Zhang move on to new and different opportunities, we had absolutely no reason to worry about maintaining the momentum of our work at the China Center. Joan Brzezinski, who is director of the University of Minnesota's Confucius Institute, was persuaded to serve once again as the interim director of the China Center, a position she has held more than once before. Joan is a talented leader and a dedicated, lifelong student of Chinese language and culture. The China Center is in very, very good hands. Please join me in welcoming Joan Brzezinski.
Xinyan hao, 大家好. Happy New Year. I hope the Year of the Rabbit is treating you well. We are extremely pleased to have you here this afternoon as we mark the 10th annual lecture in this series. The Bob and Kim Building U.S.-China Bridges lecture is the China Center's preeminent lecture on timely topics about China, its people, its culture, and development. If this is your first time attending and you were drawn to our lecture because of the topic of urbanization, we do have additional information about the Global Spotlight program that Associate Vice President Dean McQuaid mentioned just a minute ago. Please take some of that with you because there's going to be a lot of good lectures on urbanization in the next 2 years. Following the lecture, I hope that you'll please join us for the reception, which is just beyond the wall behind you, and enjoy some Chinese New Year's treats on our behalf. As you are here during Chinese New Year, we'd like you to be aware that we do our annual Red Pocket Scholarship Fund drive. There are a number of ways to give to students and scholars who would like to study in China. Our appeal borrows from the Chinese tradition of providing red gift money to children in red envelopes during the new year. If you have not received this information, please do visit our website and learn how to make an online gift there. Each year, the China Center is able to help some of our brightest and best students experience study experience in China through the generosity of the supporters of this program. At this point, I was to introduce Bob Griffin, our generous benefactor. Unfortunately, I received an email just a short while ago indicating that due to an unforeseen matter, he and Kim will not join us this evening. Bob is the president and CEO of Griffin International Companies. It's one of the country's leading manufacturers and suppliers of consumer goods. It is because of Bob's generosity and his wife Kim that we are able to present this annual lecture free to the public. So now I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Edward Goetz to introduce our speaker. Dr. Goetz is a professor of urban and regional planning, specializing in housing and local community development planning and policy at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He also serves as the director for the university's Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, also known as CURA. Please welcome Dr. Goetz.
Thank you. It's my distinct pleasure to be able to introduce today's speaker, Professor Weiping Wu, Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. Professor Wu is a major scholar in our field of urban planning. Spent many years prior to her time at Tufts at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Douglas Wilder School. And her research has always focused on issues of social and spatial dynamics in cities, especially in developing countries, and in particular in China. She has produced a series of articles, a series of scholarly work on housing issues related to migration in China, and I believe it's on this topic that we will hear some comments today. She has authored, and co-edited 4 books: Pioneering Economic Reform in China's Special Economic Zones, a book on the dynamics of urban growth in 3 Chinese cities, Local Dynamics in a Globalizing World, and Facets of Globalization, International and Local Dimensions of Development. And she's currently working on a 5th book entitled, in a somewhat summary fashion, The Chinese City. And there's no one better to write that book. Her work has been sponsored by the National Science Foundation, by the U.S. Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, the World Bank, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and she has done consulting work for the World Bank and various other national and international organizations around the country. She provides services to the profession through her work as the editor of the Journal of Planning and Education Research, as well as her work on the editorial boards of the Journal of Urban Affairs, the Open Urban Studies Journal, the Journal of Urban and Regional Planning, and World Regional Studies. Again, a major contribution in many different ways to the field, and we are really quite lucky and fortunate to have her speak to us today. So without any further ado, I give you Professor Weiping Wu.
Good afternoon. It's too loud. Thanks very much for this occasion, and I'm very honored to be here. And I am also just really, really impressed with how much resource and energy that UM is putting in making global initiatives and international issues center stage, not only for the students, but as well as for the community. So I really admire that, and I wish you all the success. So I understand this is really a nice time in a way that every Chinese New Year around either beginning of February or end of January, Chinese celebrate this holiday, but you've seen a lot of news coverage in terms of how the migrants create every year perhaps the largest human movement that we have seen. And this is really sort of in a way capturing of that movement. And so what I want to do today is really in a way of saying how this movement really has created both opportunities and challenges for the Chinese cities, and in a way also trying to, in my work in the last 10 years or so, I've studied the migration in China for about 12 years now. I've also wanted to really look at China, not just because it's unique or it is very important, really so also look at China in a context with other countries around the world. In fact, the main reason that I began to study migration in China was that I went to Brazil in 1996, and I saw the rows and the rows of favelas, or you could say squatter settlements, and they really struck me in the sense of how the Chinese path to urbanization might be similar or might be different. So in a way, I know that your thematic scope is on urbanization this year, and then your regional emphasis is on Latin America. So in a way, you will see in many ways there are some similarities and differences. So I'm very pleased to be here. And so in the next 30 minutes or so, what I want to do is, again, not only place China in the context of other developing countries going through urbanization, but also to place China's migration in the large economic transition that the country is going through. So I wanted to do that, and also give you some, perhaps some ways of thinking about migration, particularly migration in China, that have been proposed by various scholars, and myself included. And then I would like to walk you through a more sort of specific case, which is housing, really to see how migrants live and work in cities and how they access the full range of social benefits, as in the case of housing. So that really gives you a little bit of a depth. And with that, I would like to take a look at the patterns we have seen, particularly in the two largest cities in China, of migrants finding housing, looking for housing, and settling down, albeit sort of temporarily in the official terms. And last but not least, to really look at how migrants and migration are, or perhaps maybe and will be, transforming the Chinese city. So that's what we'd like to do today. And we'll have time for questions and answers toward the end. Sometime last year, perhaps I think beginning of last year, that we know a very important watershed happened in the world. That is, for the very first time, the world became urban, or majority urban. That is to say, the percentage of world population that live in urban areas now exceeds 50%. But we also know that different countries define urban very differently. In the United States, for instance, the Census Bureau defines an urban place as a concentrated area of population with about 2,500 people. And in Sweden, it's 200 people. In China, it's 20,000 people at least. So it's really, we're looking at urban sort of comparatively of different definitions. So when we look at urbanization, we do agree it's about movement of people changing from rural origins to urban areas. It is also about places transforming from rural nature, primarily agriculture, to non-agriculture or urban nature. But we know that the scale and scope of urbanization can be measured very differently across countries. And so in China, the urbanization, the scale and the scope perhaps is much more tremendous. So one of the driving forces, in fact, one of the major driving forces, is migration. Migration from rural areas to urban areas. And this migration, which has happened since 1983, when the central government relaxed some of the early policies controlling mobility of people, i.e. allowing peasants to come to cities, quote unquote, on a temporary basis, as long as these peasants could take care of their own food needs as well as some other needs, which we'll look at a little bit later. So 1983 was this major turning point. That turning point was really, in a sense, the confluence of a number of forces that at work. And that I wanted to draw you to what sort of the types of changes that have happened in China domestically. The first and foremost, most of you have already read and heard and know a lot about this, that is the transition of the economy from a command to a market economy. That is also creating the various different types of institutions that allow market to operate. And labor, if we see migrants more as an abstract entity, as labor, really has been and was in 1983 a major component of this market reform, because before 1983, the mobility of people going from one place to another was very, very low, all right? Not just for the peasants, but also for other urban residents. So that was really the largest sort of, in a sense, of context. But within that context was also the transition of the Chinese economy from a more agricultural-based one to a manufacturing or industrial economy. And we'll have some, as you will see, the data here that shows in a matter of 28 years, agricultural is no longer the biggest sector of employment for Chinese. Together with the opening up, meaning, or together with the transition to a market economy, the Chinese economy also opened up to foreign activities in the case of trade and investment. And if we think about how American manufacturing and factories and so on have been going overseas, perhaps the largest tide really started in the late 70s and early 80s, which really also opened up this opportunity for China. So that is another major driving force of this sort of opening up the mobility patterns for migrants, because there was drastic and enormous demand for cheap labor and for production in the export industries that China began to attract. And as you will see a little later, that how much of the factories in Guangdong or factories in Shanghai and Beijing are really employing these migrants in their workforce. Last but not least, or not really quite, I mean, sort of the rural-based to urban-based society, that transition is really very much related to the agricultural to manufacturing transition. But last but not least is also a demographic watershed in China, or change. As you all are aware of, China has been enforcing the one-child policy since 1979. And as a result, the enforcement of that policy varies very much. So in rural areas, the enforcement was much weaker in a sense than urban areas. And so what we are seeing is the population growth in urban areas has been much, much slower at a rate of perhaps 1% to 2% for the last few decades. But in rural areas, most families have 2 children, so the growth is much higher. So we began to see, even in the 80s, certainly by the 90s, that there was also a lack of labor or people of the most vital age of their working time in the cities. So there was a demand, not just for the export industries, but also for a lot of general urban industries, a demand for younger and hardworking workers. And so the migrants fill that niche as well. So in a way, what I call is that China has been going through a demographic transition that is both birth rates and the death rates have been declining. And we all know that United States is basically at the fourth stage at which that population growth overall is very, very low. Unlike many developing countries, China now is already getting into the third stage. That means death rate is already fairly low, but birth rate is rapidly decreasing because of the one-child policy. And so China is getting older. And despite the fact that China is still a poor country in general, it is getting older at a much faster pace than many developing countries. And for our country here, United States, we got rich first, then we got older. But for China, it is getting older before it is getting rich. So that is a particularly prominent feature in urban areas. So the need for labor is fairly enormous in all urban areas, not just in sort of the southeast and coastal areas where export industries are mushrooming. So given that, so you think, okay, so the migration wasn't just a product of market transition. Let's assume if China did not go through the market transition as sort of in a way that we've seen in the last 3 decades, but as the country industrialized, as the country opened up to the outside world, and as the country also goes through this demographic transition, the need for younger and stronger laborers and workers, and the need to allow people to be able to move more freely will be there and needs to be there. And so what we're seeing is in China, the migration is not going to sort of stop or even in a way of decrease in magnitude for quite a bit time to come. So this is a feature that is going to be a dominant trend in China for a number of decades as we see. So here as I sort of look at sort of the large context, and to be more specific and compared to other developing countries, that China also has other common features that drive migration. That is industrialization, and as you can see how it's being proceeding, but also the income disparity. How much people are making in rural areas, how much people are making in urban areas is hugely different. So on the matter of 3-to-1 or at least 2-to-1. And so the incentives for people to come to urban areas to make a better living is very, very strong. And that is basically a common factor in all developing countries. In fact, if you look at all developing countries, one of the major driving forces of urbanization is migration, and one of the major driving forces of migration is the pool of better opportunities in cities. And then, given that China has another layer of unique sort of policy background, that is, ever since 1958, we've had a Hukou system, or household registration system, in which that people and households would need to be registered in one place and one place only for their residence. And so that system was very effective from 1958 to about 1983 in keeping people where they were. And so despite the fact that Chinese arable land is limited, especially when you look at it by per person standard, it's perhaps 1/10 of what US has. But farmers and peasants weren't able to move out of the countryside until 1983, primarily because of this institutional framework, or the Hukou, or the household registration system, that didn't allow people to move. Then you can say, well, so what? We could move. Why did we register in one place, right? For those of you who come from China and who had lived in China, you would understand that it's not only because of the residency requirement, but it's also because the residency requirement was and still is associated with a number of social benefits. That would include, at that time, food rationing, that time and today, access to public education, particularly for children. At that time and today, access to certain state or government jobs, and that time, access to subsidized healthcare. Today, healthcare has been commodified, so that hasn't been a major issue. So as you will see, once the Hukou system was more or less relaxed in 1983, the flood of migrants began to form, and the magnitude is unprecedented. So today, I think if we look at, this is not biannual kind of measure, like each year how many people are moving from place to place. This is a stock measurement so far, how many people have been moving. The estimate is anywhere between 150 to 200 million people. And that is about a half of US population of 300, just over 300 million of US people. So it is very large, perhaps the largest ever in history. It also is a very peculiar form of migration, that it is what we call circular or seasonal migration. That is, the migrants are much more connected, remain to be connected to their home bases, partially because of the restriction continue to be functioning that they cannot change their household registration to cities. So they feel their future eventually still is back home, and therefore they go back and forth. Partially also because land in China's rural areas is almost quasi-private. It's collective, but the farmers all have a piece of land. And so that land can serve as a mean of social security for them, because the social security reform in China essentially primarily applies to urban residents. So the farmers don't have a retirement system that we're used to here, or social security system that we're used to here. So the land and the income that can be generated from land is a form of social security for them to hold on to. So they want to hold on to that, to their share of the collective land. So lots of migrants come back and forth between the countryside and cities. And that's why we're seeing this massive movement during Chinese New Year to go back to their home bases to celebrate the most important holidays in China. And so in a sense, it's very peculiar, because if you go to Brazil, you go to Sao Paulo, or you go to Mumbai, India, what you see, most of the migrants come to cities with family in tow, and they intend to settle in the cities. And so their behavior patterns, the way in which they invest in housing, they invest in children's school, are very different from the Chinese migrants, because they, you could say not voluntarily, but in a way forced to see, or perhaps unwillingly seeing cities not necessarily as their eventual places to live. And as you may also recognize that the Chinese migrants are very similar to other migrants around the world, that they are primarily men, they're primarily very young, and a lot of them migrate without their children. However, family migration is on the rise. We began to see more and more migrant children in the cities. And last but not least, geographically, as you will see, that the East Coast, so on this map, you can see the southeast coast, particularly at the bottom, the Guangdong province or canton, in an old way of saying it. It really is the largest destination for migrants. And many of the migrants come from the central region of the country, or even the west. And China's geography in many ways is similar to the US in the sense of size and so on, but its economic geography is very different. Everything very much concentrates on the coast, and the coast also is the region that hosts the largest number of cities and the largest cities. So this is very clear. There's sort of unidirection flow of the migrants. Although the majority of the migrants actually stay within their provinces or in the equivalent of an American state. But if you look at the interprovincial flows, they go to very much the coast. And as you will see, the Guangdong province is also where many of the foreign factories and export processing facilities are located. So given that large context, given that you now see what migrants really sort of are like in terms of their characteristics, I want to draw your attention then to this very troubling, in a way, of how migrants are seen by both the people in cities in China as well as perhaps by the government. That is, their labor is very much desired, right? And they are important element for the full functioning of the urban economy as well as for the export competitiveness of the Chinese economy. On the other hand, there continue to be fairly exclusive practices at local levels. That is, the Hukou system is still in effect in cities, particularly the very large cities. Actually, in the smaller cities and small towns, Hukou is no longer that important. But in large cities, Hukou is still very important. So that limits the access of migrants to some urban benefits. And so for many scholars, actually, that Chinese migrants really are treated very differently from the urban residents. That is, they can't get certain state sector jobs, particularly in government agencies and institutions, unless they go through higher education, college, and then they go through the civil service exams. But if you are regular migrants, and then when you have recruitment from these agencies, you are generally not eligible because you don't have a local hukou. And in terms of housing, which we'll see a little bit more in detail in a little bit, there are various different forms of housing that are not available to migrants. And then in terms of public education for migrant children, there's a very limited access and all different kinds of obstacles. So some scholars, as a result, even think of China's migrants as almost equivalent to international immigrants. And in a way, almost a colleague of mine and I have done a small piece of work that we really compare the behavior patterns and housing of China's migrants with undocumented immigrants in the United States, how much they rely on non-market or informal ways to access housing. So you will see a little bit that in a little bit later. So in a way, even after migrants who have moved from rural to urban areas, the divide between urban and rural continues to go with them. And that, to many China watchers, really now is one of the fundamental sort of basis of social inequality in China. We always know in China, urban and rural areas were unequal in terms of income. But now that people can move, but even after they move, that inequality gets transported into cities. And in a way, as you will see later, that some of the migrants become the emerging group of urban poor. Now, that said, it is not to say that this migration or group of migrants do not see more opportunities. In fact, in my own work, how I studied migrants and so on, I've had an opportunity to talk to hundreds and hundreds of migrants, primarily in the two largest cities in China, Beijing and Shanghai. And I have personal contact with quite a number of them over the years. And they will tell me that despite the hardship that they have to go through in cities, that you will see a little bit later, that they continue to see cities offering better opportunities for themselves and for their children, and their living standards have been increased drastically than if they had stayed in the countryside. So in a way, migration is very positively perceived by many migrants, but I think my argument and the argument of many scholars is that their opportunities can be further widened and broadened if this institutional framework is further relaxed. And so I don't want you to walk out in saying that there are no opportunities and so on for migrants. In fact, some migrants are doing very well in cities. They bring capital, they bring their social network to cities, and they are becoming the middle class and so on, but that's a small percentage. So yeah, I think this big screen is very, very helpful. So now I want to use the case of housing as a showcase to illustrate how the limited access migrants have in cities when they try to find a place to live. So the Chinese housing market is very peculiar. It is also a market that is still undergoing transition. So that's why you're seeing the various different kinds of housing. And the commodity housing is what we are most used to in this country. That is housing units you can buy on the market, and you can use agents and so on. And as we also know in China, urban living primarily happens in apartment housing. So we're not looking at single-family homes here. We're looking at apartments. And we also have a couple of forms of affordable housing provided on the market. The main type is what we call economic and comfortable housing. And that has to be confined to low-income and middle-income groups, but only urban residents can buy such housing. And you also probably know that before market reform, Chinese cities had large stock of public housing. And these public housing is very different, and was very different from our public housing around here. And they're generally apartment buildings, generally for rent. And so with the market reform, these type of housing have been basically marketized or commodified and sold to sitting tenants. So migrants couldn't get access to that. And then another form of affordable housing with government subsidy is called low-rent housing, only available to urban residents. Resettlement housing is a type of temporary housing for local residents to use when their old residential areas are going through redevelopment. So what you're looking at is the bottom three types that are really kind of become more available to migrants. Of course, the top one, the commodity housing. So private housing, these were legacy housing, essentially, that was left over from several decades ago when China was not socialist. Dormitory housing is very much of a legacy of the socialist period in which companies still provide housing for their workers. And the last type is a very small chunk in which local agencies and governments renovate certain old housing stock and rent to migrants. So as you will see, owning a place to live in cities for migrants is very difficult. You either buy very expensive ones on the market, or you buy quite old units. So renting is the main way of finding a place to live. And because I've talked about how the behaviors of migrants is different from migrants in other countries in which they come to cities to settle, and so for these migrants to be able to find a good job to make money and then send the money back to their home base, and to be able to invest as little as possible or to spend as little as possible in living in cities, really are their primary determination in looking for housing. And before we get into that, let's take a look at the kind of situations they live in. And so for them, cheap housing, close to work, really are the highest priorities for them. And so for that, you can see migrant housing or housing in which migrants live in is temporary, overcrowded, and often with very little kind of facilities such as bathroom and kitchen, as you will see in the pictures. The first one to the left is a dormitory. The middle one is a tailor who opens up his own little shop, and then he has his sort of bedroom in the behind the workshop. The last one is a little vendor. So migrants do work in different areas of cities. They work in the factories, as we see in the dormitory. They also work in sort of self-employed opportunities, as you will see in the other two. But if you even bring them together to see how they live, the conditions are far worse than urban residents. I don't have the numbers up here, but in Shanghai, we find migrants occupy 1/3 of the space on average of what urban residents have, and a large percentage of them don't have access to kitchen or bathroom and so on. And a lot of them also live in fairly poor environment, plus the conditions are being poor. And you look at the left image and you wonder, is this squatter settlements? That's one thing that's been very unique, and I have written about this, is that squatter settlements in Chinese cities are actually very difficult to find. And migrants, self-built housing or to sort of first squat a piece of land and then build very simple shacks, and then over time trying to improve that, and over time trying to become more permanent residents, as we have seen in other Latin American countries. That is not happening in China. I mean, this is already more than 20 years of migration. We haven't seen much of that at all. Partially is because official restriction and official enforcement and the land being primarily owned by the government. And so this is not a squatter settlement. This is actually a legal set of transitional housing owned by the local people in Beijing, and then they rent out to migrants. And these are actually a little bit better kinds of housing for migrants. This is sort of the migrant housing complex. And so, but it's also troublesome in a way that only migrants live here. So they don't interact with the urban residents. If you look at the early pictures, for instance, this middle image, the workshop is actually in the urban neighborhood, and the migrant himself actually mostly have urban residents as his clients. And so they have some interaction, but this type of migrant complex really is sort of in a way putting migrants in one corner and not so much together or interacting with other urban residents. So that's the overall conditions of migrant housing. And what I have found also, given that mentality of not investing in housing a great deal, given that they want a good job and having the housing closest to the job, is that the migrants, they are moving already from rural areas to urban areas, but once they come into the cities, they continue to be on the move. And so I call it drifting in the city. That is, if you look at, one is in Beijing, one is in Guangzhou. Beijing is the capital city. Guangzhou is the capital city of the Guangdong province to the southeast. And so on average, in the first year of coming to Beijing, or to a less extent to Guangzhou, a migrant would move at least once in the first year. And then the second year move a little less, the third year move less, and the longer they have stayed in the city, the less they move, okay? So on average, every migrant moves once, at least once the first year. Now, mind you, this is not a panel data. That is to say, I didn't follow these migrants over 12 years. I simply looked at migrants who have lived at different intervals and how long they have moved. So it's not quite as telling. But to give you point of comparison, the urban residents in Beijing during 2000, right around the same year, moved only 4 urban residents out of 100 moved once in 1 year. So the mobility is hugely different. So that is to say, migrants are continue to be on the move once they come to the cities. I also say, I have these lots of different words which you really don't need to get into, is that but even though they move, they actually get stuck. They get stuck in 2 ways. One way is they get actually stuck in pretty much one small geographical area of the city that they become very familiar with. And particularly in large cities, since I've been mostly studying large cities, so that would be Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, and so on. And so they don't actually drift a lot across cities. And that has a lot to do with the complexity of urban life and the sort of the social connections they have cultivated once they move to the cities. So they tend to move quite close by. And so that's one way I call it as stuck. And that is actually quite similar. Lots of scholars have looked at Mexico City and other large Latin American cities and find the same thing. They generally, geographically fairly stationary. The second way of what I say as getting stuck is that they're not improving their housing conditions over time. They're still renting. They're still renting sort of what we call private housing, very poor conditions. Very few of them become homeowners, and very few of them enlarge their housing space. And so that's very, very different from migrants in Latin America. In Latin America, in many Latin American cities, and as well as in other countries, the migrants, when they first come to cities, they tend to be renters. They tend to come to the central part of cities where jobs are more available. And then over time, they tend to move out to the more suburb areas of the city and tend to begin to build shacks or what we call self-help housing. And over time, they gradually improve those housing. And over time, they begin to have a sense of neighborhood. And that transition is not happening in Chinese cities for the migrants. And so in a way, migrants continue to be, in a way, what we call footloose in the cities. And but one area that is similar to other cities around the world is where migrants are concentrating. That is around the central city. That is more in the, I wouldn't call them suburbs, because if you go to China or even if you go to other developing countries, the areas outside the central city are not the same way as what we see as suburbs. They actually tend to be less viable environments for jobs, and the quality of housing tends to be not necessarily the best, because we know in many cities in China as well as in other developing countries, the central city actually sometimes tends to have the best opportunities, the best commercial facilities, the best apartments and so on, and land value is the highest and housing value is the highest, but it's also the most expensive. So for migrants, coming to just outside the central city has become a more popular choice. As you will see, this is Shanghai. And as you see on the left-hand side is the absolute number of migrants in some of the neighborhoods in the area just outside the central city. And then the right-hand side is the proportion of migrants in total population. As you will see, in some of these neighborhoods, you have more migrants than local residents. So they're really transforming these neighborhoods. I think many of the scholars generally agree that migrants began to form their own what we call satellite and daughter communities or urban villages in these places where they concentrate, they practice a lot of the same kind of economic activities together, be it specializing in small workshop for the garment factory, or they do vegetable cultivation and so on for urban agriculture. So in a way, it helps them to deal with urban life in a more collective fashion. And so that's the positive side of migrants concentrating in one area of the city. But the other not so positive aspect of that is we began to see lower income and poor migrants also concentrate in certain parts of the city. And so really in terms of their spatial trajectories, so we talked about the housing conditions and the time factor, how they drift, and in terms of how they get stuck in the types of housing. And last is in terms of how spatially they concentrate. There are also patterns that are in some ways similar to other developing countries. So, so with that, you have a somewhat of an understanding of how migrants maneuver the housing market and find a place to live in the cities. And we also have asked the hundreds and thousands of migrants we worked with and surveyed and how they actually, in what ways do they look and find housing? And do they actually go through the sort of market mechanism, with the agent, with ads and so on? Or do they actually go through more sort of people they know at work, people they know from back home, people they know through relatives and co-villagers? As you will see clearly when migrants first come to cities, that social network and social connections are really, really important. They rely much more on what we call an informal network, that is people by word of mouth and by introduction of other friends and relatives and co-villagers. But as they stay in cities a little bit longer, they began to rely a little less on those informal network. But we have seen a very similar behavior as even in the United States, but certainly in other developing countries, is the importance of the so-called informal housing market. That is, one migrant is doing very well, he'll rent a whole big building from a local resident, and then he or she will rent as a second landlord to other migrants. And in fact, lots of Ecuadorians and other Latin American Hispanic immigrants in New York and Long Island also practice a similar system. So that is also what we began to see in China, because so much of the formal market is not available to migrants. And so lots of migrants go through informal channels to find housing. So to conclude, I wanted to just draw your attention to the impact that is already there or potentially will be there of this large migration and of the ways in which migrants find housing and settle in cities and on the cities in general. And that is, we already are seeing Chinese cities not so equal anymore, right? In the socialist period, if you go around Beijing or Shanghai, pretty much everybody who lived in different parts of the city were living in a similar way, and their income levels were similar. And today, with the market transition, we already began to see there's the upper corner in certain cities, there's the lower corner in other parts of the same city. And we are seeing that migrants add even more to that dynamic, that migrants are becoming sort of increasingly, or particularly some migrants, becoming this and forming this large group of what we call the emerging urban poor. And we also have seen some of these migrant urban villages forming in Chinese cities. So last, I want to sort of bring you to the fact that this emerging urban poor has the element of the next generation, that is the migrant children and the way in which they are growing up in China. So in Chinese cities and so on. This is really a challenge for the Chinese government as well as for substantially for the cities that are really receiving these migrants, how to really integrate them and how to really provide the kind of services that are available to other urban residents. So these are some images of migrant schools. These are much like the migrant housing complex. These are schools that only migrant children go to. And these are schools that are not necessarily officially permitted. They operate in the gray area. So again, this is from Beijing. This is from Shanghai. That's from Beijing. If you recognize the Chinese characters, you will be very surprised because this was in Shanghai, but the school has Anhui province tag. So these basically tell you that the principal of the school is a migrant from Anhui, and he or she actually uses textbooks from those provinces and not from Shanghai. So I've visited quite a number of migrant schools, and the conditions in which they study are far worse than local children. And then, and these schools are not under the auspices of the local school districts and the bureaus. And so they are quite a bit, so there's a large range of quality in teaching. But also the most important challenge also is that these children can only go up to 6th grade by going to these schools. So they have to go back home to either pursue further education or stop going to school or pay higher fees to go to urban schools. And so the next generation really is posing new challenges for cities in China. And as I said at the very beginning, that this tide of migration is in no way reducing in magnitude and in pace. And many of the migrants who go back to home during Chinese New Year will go back after Chinese New Year, usually 2 weeks vacation, and go back to their old jobs. And some may move on to another job in a different city, but generally we're seeing most migrants come back after Chinese New Year. And so this is going to go on for quite a number of decades, perhaps. And the projection for China's population growth is that by about 2035, the working age population will really be shrinking, will really be starting to go down. And so the need for migrants will perhaps be even larger. So I guess I end my talk by raising this question to you in a way of how these migrants can be really integrated into the urban society in a way that would be very fair and equal and productive. So I will just end there and take any questions you may have.
We have 2 microphones here, so if you want to come up to speak to the microphone, that would be best. And everybody can hear your question.
It's, of course, really fascinating always to hear about the scale of these migrations in China today. And it's impressive in and alone on that level. But actually, I think probably one way to get a sense of what this means, especially in cross-cultural analysis or cross-national analysis, is to have a sense of the rates of rural migration. Are we talking about 2% in a year? Are we talking about 0.5% in a year? And if we look at rates rather than at absolute numbers, since of course China's total population is so huge itself, if we look at rates, how does China compare to other developing nations today or developing Western nations in the past? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And part of the difficulty in measuring rates in China has a lot to do with the population enumeration system. That is only starting in 2000 that the census began to be based on where you live, not where you register. So only really by about 2000, we had a clear sense of the magnitude. Yes, so the rates are essentially an estimate. So let me give you a large picture, and then we can see the rates. And this is actually, I'm very glad you raised this question, because actually, in all of the scholarly coverage of Chinese migration, nobody looks at rates, because it's not reliable, and also because so many migrants are circular, and so how do you really track that, right? So basically, today's the urbanization level in China is 46%. And so that is to say we have about 54% of the population live in the countryside. In 1980, that was about 76%. So in a matter of 30 years, we have essentially moved about 20-some% of the population from rural areas to urban areas. But that is still misleading, because the increase in the urbanization rate in some instances has to do with redistricting of cities. So you could be actually rural yesterday, and then tomorrow, because of redistricting, you are urban again. And another misleading aspect to this is in Chinese statistical system, you might be living in the city, for instance, in Beijing or Shanghai, but you actually have a rural house Hukou registration. And that's why it is so difficult to really say rate. Is it 10%? Is it 20%? But what we can see is in terms of the percentage of rural population on the move, if we look at that, we're looking at least a double digit every year. So that's the best answer I can give you. So that's a really good question, because I have actually never thought about it in that way, because nobody really look at it yet that way. But I think to compare, that's a much better way to do it, yeah. And so this past year in November 2010 will be the second census that has been based on place of residence instead of a place of registration. I think that will provide a better comparative reference point to look at that kind of movement, as if we have the 2000 data and look at it longitudinally. Yeah. Thanks.
You suggested that the need for migrant workers is going to continue into the coming decades. Do you anticipate changes in housing policy to produce a more permanent solution for this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really quite, clear that I've studied the migration for the last 12 years or so, and the overall change in policy has been opening up. In the early 80s and even late 80s, policies towards migration were much more restrictive. The attitudes tend to be much more negative. When crime rates were going up, migrants were to blame, and so on, all that typical sentiment. And now, increasingly, migrants are becoming sort of commonplace in cities and more accepted by local governments as well as residents in cities. In terms of really, truly, providing the concrete solutions to integrate migrants, there was a very major move in 2005 in terms of allowing children of migrants to go to local schools more easily, and allowing migrants to have a little longer term of residency permits in cities. But fundamentally, the implementation of those central policies was problematic, because migration is not a local issue. Migration is a national issue. But the responsibilities to provide for migrants are local. And so there hasn't been a very effective transfer system at the central level. Physical decentralization is another major issue to how to deal with that, is that many large cities are not willing to be more open to migrants, because if you are, then more migrants are coming. So for instance, the largest city, Shanghai, it doesn't want to say that, but it actually has more than 5 million migrants. It officially is only willing to admit it's 4 million or so, or 3 million, because of some opening up in schools really have allowed more migrants to come in. So now I think the main debate is not so much for local governments to provide more. It's really, I think, the central debate among scholars and the policymakers is, can we disassociate the registration system, the Hukou system, from the provision of social welfare? That can we basically allow migrants to not to be restricted in housing and public education or certain jobs because of their difference in registration. So the large debate now is about getting rid of Hukou. Or in some ways, this is, you could use Hukou as a population registration system, but not so much as a basis for providing benefits. But that is a really big question, and it's been debated for quite a number of years, and it hasn't really been implemented. But in many smaller cities in China, Hukou is not that important anymore, and migrants are doing better. But on the other hand, the job opportunities are not as abundant as in large cities. So I think the main hot spots are the large cities that are not quite willing to open up.
I wish we don't have to come to talk. I actually have a question and a comment. My question is, well, it seems like the crux of the problem is really people must move to where their jobs are. This survival. And the East Coast cities are the ones that develop first, right? And I'd like you to probably inform us in terms of the government's policy or initiatives or help in creating more job opportunities in the inner city, the inner part of China or the West cities, maybe through tax or through subsidy or through whatever, to stop the migration continuously from rural into urban. That's my first question. My comment is, I can't help but think about our country, United States, and think about the Mexican population. And my conclusion is that human nature seems to be the first comers are not very generous with the latecomers. The haves are not very generous with the have-nots. And you can say that globally about what's happening in China or looking at our own country and the lack of opportunities for the Mexican migrants, the immigrants, we call them, to come here for the education for the young. And when you don't have that, I truly worry about a whole generations of subclass people. And that, to me, is the seeds of urban unrest and social unrest and instability.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm putting up this map here for you to, be able to see what her comments and my response are really geographically anchored. China's geography really is very spatially uneven. That is, 90% or almost 94% of the population lives to the east. So if you draw a line from the most northern tip to the most southern tip, this is sort of an imaginary line we call Tengchong Xian. And then to the east is 40% of the territory and 94% of the population. To the west is 60% of the territory and 6% of the population. It's always been uneven. And so it's, in a way, not just the doing of the market transition. The disparity between the East and West has been long-standing one. But we have evidence to show that that disparity is actually has increased during market transition. and during the last 30 years, basically. And the migration is certainly, in a way, accompanying that process. I wouldn't say attributing to that process. So, of course, that is very much of a concern to the government, at least sometimes, theoretically, because policies don't always follow the talk. But the interesting part is actually, I go to China and talk to scholars. Many scholars actually believe that the equity issue is important, but they feel that the West, in terms of geography, is much less friendly for development, much unfriendly for development. And the cities on the East are much more efficient. And why can't we just let the cities take advantage of that efficiency and grow the economy faster? Lots of Chinese scholars feel that way. They feel that the migrants should be, encouraged to move where the jobs are, instead of pouring lots of resources into areas that probably don't have much of a future. And a lot of the scholars, really borrow the experience of, let's say, Italy, the South and the North, and is never even, and the national government pours tons and tons of money, and it hasn't really reversed that. And the same with, if you look at Indonesia, a closer neighbor, the outer islands receive a lot of investment and never really caught up. And so the scholars feel that China has that similar situation. So when in the early 2000s, when the government began this big development program called Going West, which is essentially about creating more opportunities, and particularly through transportation infrastructure development, to open up the West to investment and to new opportunities, a lot of scholars are not supportive of that. And so today, that Go West program is still fairly strong in that sense, but it is one of the few isolated programs that are ongoing. And there are other aspects of China's development that are not in sync with that. For instance, in terms of taxation, how income taxes are collected in China, which is essentially local governments collect, send into the central government, then repatriate back to the local governments again on a fixed percentage formula. So the richer places will get more in absolute amount. And there isn't a very effective transfer system to allow the interior provinces to receive more resources in terms of physical resources. So the Go West program is a more sort of big projects, transportation, railroad, but from the day-to-day operation of local governments, the cities to the central and the west have a much challenging job to provide for the residents. In my different line of work, I've looked at infrastructure financing at local levels across different regions. And so in a way, the various different policies are not in sync to really allow the west and the central region to catch up. And, but I wanted to sort of let you know that there are also debate within China whether that policy is an effective one at this stage.
Your research suggests that a lot of migrant workers rely upon their own people, their own community in finding jobs and housing. So I'm wondering that given that the emergence of grassroots movement in China, whether there is a civic engagement role that could play helping their situation where civic engagement, their greater civic engagement would increase the public awareness of their living conditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a very important area that a lot of non-governmental organizations have stepped in, including some Western non-governmental organizations and some indigenous ones. That is a very difficult area to really pinpoint where the future really would be. There are several reasons for that. One is labor in general has a very low place in the domestic politics. That is not just labor for the migrant labor, it's labor in general. If we look at union, if we look at collective bargaining, labor, the power of labor is extremely low in the Chinese politics. And, and then in addition, these are rural peasants and in a way are far less educated and organized than the urban workers. Second is that nonprofit or non-governmental organizations still have an undefined place or position in Chinese society. That is, in fact, by our standards, there really isn't any non-governmental organizations in China. Some of the ones are essentially affiliated with government organizations. Others are registered as business entities. So there isn't a sort of a true sense of independence of civic engagement. So the government's attitude so far is quite encouraging in areas of environmental protection. So lots of environmental NGOs are doing quite well, or in terms of children's diseases and so on. But in terms of organizing for the rights of labor, it's a very sensitive issue. And so not a lot of NGOs are really in that area of operating. Yes, we began to have workers' rights and legal aids and so on, but that continue to be monitored very strictly and oftentimes intervened very strictly by the government. So what we have seen is more sort of ad hoc organizing by migrants, and perhaps more particularly in the area of fighting for wage payments individually towards different enterprises, different firms. And we also have seen a little bit more rural unrest in terms of illegal land seizures by local governments. But in terms of protecting the rights of migrants, the collective voices are really quite weak. And there are some scholars who are very, very vocal. There are some news outlets, few of them very vocal, but in general, this is not an area we've seen a lot of social sort of fermentation of seeds of change. It's not an area that we've seen a lot. Because it does have the potential to create instability, and that is very threatening for the government. So labor organizing has always been very closely monitored, and it's been a very difficult area. So when I talk to migrants, when I go to factories to visit them, I don't see that going. Crisis happened, and then the recent one, I guess that's what you are asking for. There have been some repercussion on migration. That is, we began to see tapering off of this annual flow right around 1999, 1998. And the same with the recent economic downturn. But I think the real dynamic that's going on in China, particularly in Southeast China, is that the migrants have learned. And that's one positive aspect, that migrants now are more aware of. If you go to Guangdong, go to Dongguan, go to these various factories, they have now known enough friends and co-villagers who work in different factories. They have now know, what can you expect in terms of wage levels, what you can expect in terms of compensation, what you can expect in terms of disability benefits, or if we have accidents at work. So labor costs in general have risen in southeast part of China. And migrants are becoming more demanding in compensation. So with that, so there's sort of a self-selection process that in a way, if the jobs don't pay as well, then they won't take it. So that's in together working with the, not so much together, actually counter the economic downturn. So in the last couple of years, what has happened is that lots of factories in the southeast part of China has begun to see labor shortages. So in a way that they are having hard time finding the cheapest labor that you could get around. And so China has begun to lose its competitive advantage in a sense, if you call it, in being the cheapest location for export manufacturing. So the impact of the downturn is really quite complex. You can't say it really has created a lot of return migration. This is very unlike some other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand or Malaysia and Indonesia during the East Asian economic crisis, where there's a lot of reverse migration and return migration happening. That hasn't happened in China much at all. So there's other dynamics at work.
Thank you so much, Professor Wu, for your very interesting and informative lectures. And I'm very impressed by the skill and depth of your research. And I'm studying comparative and international education and interested in the readiness of job market in China to college graduates. And recent studies has shown that more and more college graduates in China are employed in cities where their Hukou is not registered. So some scholars have defined them as a new group of migrant workers. And I want to know your definition of this group of workers, and also what kind of policy influence do you think they may bring or they may have over Chinese government? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in my presentation, I didn't really say it up front very clearly. My presentation really focuses on migrants who are what we call labor migrants and who generally are poor, or not necessarily poor in a sense, but rural peasants who don't necessarily have very good education, who are relying on hard labor to make living. But you are absolutely right. The migration flow also includes a group of people who are highly skilled and highly educated. And these are generally college graduates and sometimes graduate program graduates. And their numbers are much smaller. And however, they're a sizable segment of the more mobile labor market. Most cities, much like in the international immigration research, most cities like those countries like Australia and Canada, most cities have very receptive policies towards this group. In fact, and these policies are generally locally set. That is, you go to Beijing, you have a set of policies. You go to Shanghai, you have a set of policies. You go to Guangzhou, you have a set of policies. These are not national policies. That is, they are much more encouraged to move. If you have a college degree, you can prove that you have a graduate degree or so on. Their time sort of span in which they can get a local registration is really not that long. And especially if you can also invest in some small business formation, if you want to create a little startup, you want to create a little company, that's even more encouraged, and it's easier to get the residence permit in the big cities. However, there remains to be this process in which whoever hires these graduates, okay, have to go through the Labor and Personnel Bureau to obtain a quota for local residency, local hukou, to officially change the household registration status of those college graduates who are hired. So there remains to be this process they have to go through, much like what we have to do here to get a green card. You have to go through that process. So I think in Shanghai, for instance, last year was the first year they began to increase that quota and to let a larger number of college graduates to get local residency. So the trick, really, I mean, the critical part for these graduates is to get a job that is either located in the state agency or company or joint venture or foreign company that would, quote unquote, be willing to sponsor them to change their residency status. So if they just come to Shanghai and still look for jobs or work in a very small company, oftentimes their chances of changing the residency can be quite tricky, and unless they invest on their own. So lots of overseas students would go back and invest, and that's not a problem. But if you are Chinese and you don't have investment and you're still not certain with your employment, they have the same situation as a typical migrant.
I'm sorry, I believe we've come to some time here that Professor Wu will remain for a little while to answer more questions, but please join me in thanking her for this fascinating discussion. Sorry to stop the dialogue. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'd like to invite our Associate Vice President and Dean Meredith McQuaid to join me with a small presentation.